Gangrene set into his legs, causing unbearable pain and a foul odor that filled the royal court. His body was so disfigured and decayed that courtiers had to cover their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs just to endure his presence. A deformed body, unbearable pain, and an odor so foul it made courtiers faint. This was the grotesque end of one of history's most powerful monarchs. After his death, bodily fluids leaked from his coffin, only to be licked up by stray dogs. Such was the horrifying fate of Henry VIII, the once mighty King of England. Today, we uncover the full truth behind his death, a story so repulsive it's often left untold. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491. At just 17, he ascended the throne and quickly earned a reputation as Europe's most handsome prince. He was tall, athletic, and carried himself with the regal bearing of a true Renaissance king. A Venetian ambassador described him as having an extraordinary figure and angelic face, surpassing the beauty of any Christian prince. How then did this model of strength and majesty come to die in such humiliation? The turning point came in January 1536, during a jousting tournament in Greenwich. At 44, Henry suffered a devastating accident. His horse collapsed on top of him, knocking him unconscious for 2 hours. Though he survived, the injury to his right leg never healed. It developed into a foul, ulcerated wound that oozed constantly and emitted a stench so intense it announced his presence before he entered a room. For a vain king who once defined masculinity and power, it was a crushing blow. Courtiers were forced to endure the odor in silence, terrified of showing revulsion and risking the king's wrath. This injury would mark the beginning of Henry's tragic decline, physically, emotionally, and politically. The Golden Prince had begun his slow, grotesque descent into darkness. The accident didn't just break Henry VIII's body, it began to unravel his mind. After falling from his horse in 1536, Henry changed. Coincidence or not, it was around this time that he sentenced his second wife, Anne Boleyn, to death on flimsy charges of adultery and treason. Some historians believe the brain injury he sustained may have intensified his paranoia, rage, and cruelty. As his mobility declined, his body ballooned. Once trim and athletic, Henry's waist swelled from 89 centimeters to over 130 centimeters. His weight soared past 180 kilograms, so massive that servants had to hoist him between rooms using a custom-built pulley system. Even doorways were widened to accommodate his frame. His daily diet only worsened the problem. Royal kitchen records show he consumed around 5,000 calories a day, mostly red meat, meat pies, and endless wine and beer with barely a vegetable in sight. Combined with his inactivity, this hastened his physical collapse. The ulcer on his leg, left untreated since the accident, grew more grotesque, oozing constantly and stinking so badly it was said you could smell him 3 rooms away. His physicians, guided by the flawed science of their day, tortured rather than healed. They cauterized his wounds with hot iron, applied salves laced with mercury and arsenic, and drained his blood regularly. The ulcer became so deep that bones were visible through rotting flesh. Still, Henry pursued companionship. At age 49, he married 19-year-old Catherine Howard. He called her his return to youth, but in truth, the union was tragic. Repulsed by her decaying, deformed husband, Catherine turned to a young courtier for affection. When Henry found out, he ordered both their executions. His final marriage to Catherine Parr, in 1543, was less about passion than survival. She became more nurse than wife, tending to the king's wounds with remarkable patience, knowing full well what had happened to the women before her. Henry's decline was no longer just physical, it was total. The Golden Prince of England had become a tyrant, crippled by pain, paranoia, and the slow decay of both body and soul. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In his final years, Henry VIII suffered greatly, both physically and mentally. Once a king of immense power and presence, he now struggled under the weight of multiple medical conditions. Modern experts believe he likely battled diabetes, severe gout, hypertension, and heart failure, though some suggest syphilis, a diagnosis that remains debated among historians. This combination of illnesses turned his last years into an endless nightmare. The pain he endured was unimaginable. Accounts from the period describe how Henry would alternate between fits of unbearable agony, during which he screamed and cursed everyone around him, and deep moments of melancholy, where he would remain motionless for hours. His behavior became erratic. The once shrewd statesman was consumed by paranoia, and he began to see enemies everywhere. Those closest to him weren't safe. Many of his former allies and friends were executed on baseless accusations. One of his greatest fears during this time was poisoning. His obsession with the idea became all-consuming, leading him to create an elaborate food security system. All his meals were carefully monitored, and every dish had to be tasted by servants before it reached his table. Every utensil was checked, as Henry believed even the smallest detail could be the means of his demise. As the end drew near, his physical condition worsened rapidly. Henry's legs became a source of constant suffering, rotting away due to gangrene. The stench was unbearable, and even those at court had to cover their noses with perfume-soaked handkerchiefs to endure his presence. The mighty king, who once commanded the highest respect in Europe, had become a grotesque spectacle. By the winter of 1546 to 1547, Henry's health deteriorated to its breaking point. His breathing became labored, and he experienced frequent delirium. It is said that during these episodes, he often murmured the names of his deceased wives, particularly Jane Seymour, who gave him his long-desired male heir. He also spoke of Anne Boleyn, whose ghost, according to some, haunted him to his final days. Despite his obvious decline, no one at court dared acknowledge his imminent death. English law declared it treason to predict the king's passing. His physicians and courtiers maintained a facade, pretending recovery was possible, even as the smell of decomposition grew stronger. As Henry VIII's end drew near, he finally allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to come to his bedside. Though unable to speak, the once powerful king squeezed Cranmer's hand when asked if he died in the Christian faith. This simple final gesture marked the last conscious act of a monarch whose reign had once reshaped the course of history. At 55, Henry's death came with the ignominy of his condition. Due to his immense size, a special coffin had to be constructed to contain his remains. Preparing his body for the funeral was a horrendous challenge for the royal embalmers, as the process of embalming at the time was rudimentary, mainly the removal of internal organs and filling cavities with aromatic herbs. But what happened next was even more macabre. The coffin, not sealed well enough to contain the gases and fluids of decomposition, began leaking. The scene in the chapel at Can Abbey was unsettling. As Henry's body lay awaiting the funeral, fluids from the decomposing corpse trickled out and were discovered by stray dogs that licked up the putrid substance. This horrifying image marked the tragic and humiliating end of a king who once defined power, majesty, and divine authority. The mighty Henry, who had defied the Pope, redefined English religion, and had 2 wives beheaded, now lay as a decaying mass of flesh, violated by street animals. The king, who had once stood unchallenged, his every command carried out, had fallen so far that even in death, he could not escape the indignity of his body's decomposition. It was a stark reminder that even the most powerful kings, no matter their deeds or legacy, must succumb to the inevitable decay of the flesh. The grand funeral of Henry VIII took place on February 16, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death. Despite the unbearable stench emanating from his decaying body, the ceremony was still conducted with all the pomp and circumstance befitting one of England's most powerful monarchs. Henry, the once feared king, was buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, and the only one who gave him the male heir he had so desperately sought, Edward VI. Ironically, it was Edward whose birth had driven many of Henry's most controversial decisions, including his break with Rome and his decision to execute 2 of his wives. Yet Edward's reign would last a mere 6 years, ending with his death from illness at the young age of 15. The throne then passed to Mary IV, Henry's first daughter from Catherine of Aragon, who sought to reverse her father's Protestant reforms, and ultimately to Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would go on to lead England into its golden age. The death of Henry VIII was not just the end of a man, but a symbol of the decline of an era. Throughout his reign, Henry had defied the Pope, redefined English religion, and disposed of human lives at will, all in the pursuit of securing a male heir and maintaining his hold on power. Yet in the end, he became a victim of his own mortal body. The mighty king, once a towering figure of power, now lay as a grotesque caricature of himself, his body ravaged by illness and the passage of time. English historian Alison Weir captures the irony of Henry's fate. It is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise, beauty, and ability ended as a grotesque caricature of himself. Tormented by physical pain and mental instability, feared and flattered by those around him, but rarely truly loved. Henry's transformation from an ideal Renaissance prince to an obese, sickly tyrant remains one of history's most compelling case studies of how absolute power, when combined with chronic pain and progressive disease, can utterly change an individual. Henry's political legacy is undeniable. The separation of England from Rome and the establishment of the Anglican Church reshaped the course of European history, and his decisions set the stage for future dynastic struggles. However, his personal end stands as a stark reminder of human fragility. The king, who once commanded supreme authority, now faced the inevitable decline of his body, and with it, the disillusionment of his own invulnerability. Henry VIII's death is not just a tale of medical horror. It is a moral lesson about the limits of human power and the inevitability of physical deterioration. His body, once admired as the embodiment of royalty, became a symbol of the transience of earthly glory. In the end, no matter how powerful or famous we all meet the same end. The death of Henry VIII serves as a haunting reminder that, despite our accomplishments, we are all equally vulnerable before death.